We're going to continue on that issue of non-negotiables when it comes to the reopening of schools, and we want to talk to Equal Education. Well, Equal Education and Equal Education Law Centre say that they want to see schools reopen in a safe manner and as soon as possible. This follows the announcement by the Basic Education Minister, Angie Motshekga, that her department is ready for schools to reopen on Monday. Now, let's take this discussion further then. We're joined via Zoom by Noncedo Madubedube from Equal Education. She is the General Secretary. Always a pleasure to see you, Noncedo. Thank you so very much for being with us here on SABC News.
Thank you so much for having us. I think it's important that we're invited onto these platforms so that learners can share sort of the lived experience of what it feels like to think about the safe return back to schools, but also to think about where the country's at. We talked about the civil unrest and the impact it's had on the schools in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, and those kinds of issues needed to be addressed by the Minister of Basic Education, provincial MECs of education as well. And the country is experiencing massive austerity with regards to social spending. And so what does it look like for the education sector? So we appreciate the platform, and we want to talk about how school communities and people that are watching and listening today could join the cause and struggle for just and equal education now.
You've mentioned in your statement that you want to see schools reopen, and certainly I think a lot of people do. But importantly, you say that the schools should reopen in a safe manner and as soon as possible. But you've also spoken about certain non-negotiables, which Mr. Trevor Shaku from SAFTU also indicated that should really be in place before we can see that, before the reality of learners going back to school and teachers going back to school. Let's talk about some of your non-negotiables that you speak of. And I know every time I've spoken to Equal Education, one of the biggest issues you've always raised, and we'll talk about it and where you are in terms of feeding schemes and feeding learners, whether they are at school or not at school. We'll talk to that, but I want you to talk to us about the non-negotiables that you have certainly been raising.
The non-negotiables we speak about in our statement are related to the non-negotiables that have been put forward by the Department of Basic Education on plans around the safe return to school. So those aren't just ours, but those are the program to respond to COVID and schooling during this period. And one of the things that we want to emphasize is around school infrastructure. Now, learners that are organized through Equal Education have been fighting for adequate and safe school infrastructure since 2010. And we've got a law promulgated, the norms and standards for school infrastructure, that hasn't been implemented or rolled out adequately by the Departments of Basic Education. Now, part of the reason we speak about it in these ways is because we still have schools that don't have water security. We still have schools with unsafe and inadequate sanitation, so long drops and plain pit latrines. These conditions go against what it means to go back to school safely and justly during this COVID period. And so we want to emphasize to the Departments of Basic Education to prioritize these structures over the next period. But what we also want to say is that we aren't looking for just temporary measures in this regard. We're also looking for governments and the Departments of Basic Education to put on fully fledged structures in these schools to make sure that there is a safe return back to schools for many learners during this period. The other type of non-negotiables that we'd like to put on the table are around the provision of personal protective equipment. And the reason I spoke about us grappling with austerity inside the basic education system is because we suddenly don't have enough money. Principals are juggling money between training for SGBs, SGB-posted teachers, and ensuring they can pay electricity and purchase PPEs off the same pot of money. Because the Department of Basic Education has redirected over 2 billion rand in response to COVID during this period. So the conditions inside schools, especially in townships and rural parts of the country, are really compromised during this period. But we are hopeful that when the Department of Education says to us, look, we are ready for the reopening in majority, that this in fact is the fact. But what we're going to do over the next week, and I invite everyone watching and listening today to join us in this search, is go into our school communities and make sure that in fact learners do have access to water, masks, sanitizers, adequate, safe and just and dignified toilets to use during this period. And to keep encouraging our teaching staff and all school community staff, in fact, to go and get themselves vaccinated so we can ensure that those environments are safe, as safe as they can during this period. And the last and most urgent is any learner you talk to right now will tell you how stressed they are. Psychosocial support is a massive call and demand from learners during this period. And it doesn't seem to me that the Department of Basic Education adequately ever addresses this in their statements and or their addresses. And so, I mean, there was a meeting the department hosted last year where they said they'd never imagined a time where they'd have to be concentrating on psychosocial support as opposed to teaching and learning.
Yeah.
And when our departments of education start realizing that those things are in tandem, you can't teach children that are traumatized and or scared. Will be a just day for the basic education system in the country. So learners do need holding during this period of deep sort of unrest and grief in our school communities and more generally.
And Noncedo, I wonder if that's linked to. I read a report, and I'm trying to remember if I read it from something that you guys might have released as Equal Education, or if I saw it elsewhere. But the report was saying that about 500,000 learners have actually dropped out of the system, and one wonders when you're raising this issue of how stressed learners are, if that perhaps could be one of the issues as to that's adding to learners perhaps dropping out. Look, there might be a myriad of other reasons why learners are dropping out, but I'm wondering if this might not be certainly one of those. I mean, 500,000 is a tremendously huge number, and I wonder what your view is on that. I mean, if these people are dropping out, if these learners are dropping out, where they're going, what's happening, why they're lost to the system, and I wonder if this is something that you're also talking to.
So in our statement, we'd hoped that the minister would address the question around over half a million learners being lost in the system over the last year. And these kinds of stats aren't untoward, right? We know that we've got a high level of dropout between when learners start grade 1 and when they finish matric. And so what we had hoped for is a serious and deliberate intervention from all departments of education, in fact, government across the board. Even the Department of Social Development must get involved here and help track those learners and find ways to return them back into the school environment. Now, last year, when we spoke on these platforms, many times frustrated, we spoke about how this would be massive losses for generations of Black youth in this country. And we wanted the Department of Education to think about their interventions with that kind of gravitas. And so this is case in point to that, right? That many of young folk that go to schools in rural and township communities, because they are stressed and they don't have support, and these channels should exist easily and freely inside of our basic education system, because of a lack thereof, and the kind of burn that our teachers in these schools are experiencing, it's difficult for learners to stay in the system. And the civic unrest has contributed, or shown us rather, the kind of very deep structural and systematic social inequalities and poverty that folk are facing in our communities. And so the onus becomes on the youngest members of those families to go off and find alternatives to feed the rest of their families. Yeah. So this is not rocket science, and we'd hoped that the Department of Basic Education would speak to it quite deliberately. Although we're encouraged about the idea of the foundation phase learning being prioritized and learners going back to school to go and sort of recapture the learning losses. But we must talk about that age gap between grades 9 and 11, because it's crucial. And that kind of downward spiral, I think, is going to show us massive loss of young people being able to finish school adequately during these times and for years to come, unfortunately.
Yeah. Let's talk to something that Equal Education is, you're passionate about a lot of issues that are linked to schooling, but one that I know that we always sort of talk to, and it's quite important to me as well, is the issue of, feeding schemes. And I just need some clarity from you. I saw somewhere there was a bid that was won in terms of food parcels that the Education Department is set to implement, and I understand that there's about a month in which the Basic Education Department must implement this. Talk to us about this. I'm understanding that there should be food parcels that are sent to learners, whether or not they're on school premises. What's the story behind that?
Look, learners are celebrating today after the address from the Basic Education Minister, because never has she spoken about school nutrition in such great detail.
Yeah.
And it's useful because this is part of a court order that we've recently been able to secure as Equal Education, supported by the Equal Education Law Sentence, Section 27. What had happened is that since about March this year, the departments of education across the board, this is now national and provincial, stopped reporting on progress on implementing the school nutrition program. Now, this is on the backdrop of an emergent third wave, on the backdrop of deep food insecurity in the country. The basic education system collapsed its commitment to feeding learners. And so we went back to the court order and went back to court and said, look, we need to reaffirm that these departments need to find practical and tangible ways to feed children during this time, because the impact of food insecurity is almost triple-fold for young children in this country. And there's an existing program that has a budget of over 6 billion rand that could accommodate over 9 million learners across the country. And so we went back and the court ordered in our favor again and said, look, the department, you've got a month between when this court order was released, which is 2 weeks ago, last week, in fact, to put together this plan and make sure that you're able to find reasonable ways to feed learners. One of the things that have come out of that, because we'll be able to light this fire underneath the of the departments of basic education, is that there's a commitment now to ensure that if learners are on a rotational system and are in fact able to be at school every single day, which is the reality of what is happening Kamashasha and Limpopo, where learners are going to school 4 times in a month. Imagine that. Is that in between that period, they aren't being fed. And so what happens to those learners and to those children? And so we've said to the department, consider using scholar transport as a means to make sure learners can access food. Consider using food parcels so that learners, whilst at home, can still have access to some kind of nutritious meal a day. And that's what they've said. Angie Motshekga now today in her briefing has said, we are going to start using and considering quite deliberately the use of food parcels. These can be picked up in common areas in different communities and or at schools. That's massive victory for learners, especially those in touching with rural provinces. The second thing is that there's been a commitment from her mouth to our ears, and people must know this and hold our governments to it, that children can go and pick up food at the school nearest to their homes. So there isn't a need for parents to then use transport and more money, which is very scarce right now, to ensure that learners can go and eat for the day. Mdana can go to the school nearest to their home to access school nutrition. That is a massive victory for learners during this period. And so we are going to persist in monitoring the implementation and rollout of that school nutrition program, because a lot is at stake for children in this country during this period.
All right, Noncedo, it was always a pleasure speaking to you, and we appreciate how Equal Education is so passionate on some of these issues that I think sometimes we forget about as a society as we go on with our lives and our own problems during the pandemic. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and certainly the passion with which you do it. Thanks so much.